Okay, folks, so now the task ahead of us is really just to translate our, what we call pseudocode, our comments pseudocode, right, describing what we're trying to do at the top of our file into actual Python code. Obviously, some of this is going to be new to you all, but hopefully you'll find it reasonably straightforward, and of course we'll be going over all of this in class. So the first thing that I need to do is actually related a little bit to step 2. So one thing that I want to do is I want to open my source data file. Actually, I can go ahead. I'm going to open my source data file. But because I want to use a library. So a library is basically like a recipe book or a set of recipe books. One of the great things about Python, about using a programming language like this, is that lots and lots of people use it for lots of different things. However, given how common comma-separated value files are, lots of people have also used it to deal with CSV files. Over time, what has happened is that people have compiled libraries or recipe books of recipes for dealing with CSV files that helps make our lives a little bit easier. So we don't have to write every single word of code to deal with these files, because other people have written them ahead of time and have shared them publicly so that we can use them without having to write all the code ourselves. But because there are so many different libraries out there, we have to be specific with our program and tell it which ones it should make sure to have available, because otherwise it would just take ages and ages for the program to load. So specifically, we're going to tell it to import the CSV library. Pretty straightforward here. Python is designed to be a little bit like English, so hopefully that makes sense, that when you want to bring a library in, you import it. And this is going to give us access to some functions that will be very useful, some recipes, methods, or functions. So now that I've done that, the first thing that I want to do is I want to open my source data file. Now, every time I do take an action, I want to put the results in my code. I want to put the results in kind of a labeled space. So we talked about this with the creation of variables. A variable is really just a label, and it's a label for what I think of as, it's really just a box in memory. It's actually what happens is when you create a variable, the computer sets aside some memory and puts and labels it with the variable name that you have chosen. And into that box, it puts whatever you tell it to put there. So in this case, the way that we do this is we create the label first. Okay, so the label that I'm going to say is, I'm going to call this source file. Okay, now you'll notice that I'm trying to make my variable name, because it's a label, I want it to be descriptive. Okay, so I'm calling it source file because it is actually me opening my source data file, as in step 1 here. So the equal sign is the action that tells the computer to put whatever comes on the right-hand side into the box with the label that appears on the left. So it's going to say, take whatever, apply the label source file to whatever I put inside of that box, which is going to be whatever appears on the right here. So in this case, I'm going to say open, okay, and open again is just a function that's already available in Python. So it's a recipe that all Python programs automatically have available. And I'm just going to say open, and then I'm going to give it my file name, which handily I have copied up here. So I'm going to say open CSV, my CSV file. And now I actually have 2 ingredients that I need to pass to this. I need to give it the name of the file that I want to open, and I need to tell it, I need to give it a second ingredient that basically lets it know what I want to do with this. And in this case, what I want to do is read the file. And so that second ingredient is going to be an R. In this case, I'm using a U because U means universal, and it just basically has to do with differences between Macs and PCs and the way that they save carriage returns. It's not interesting. RU will take care of it. But so I'm going to say, okay, create a variable to hold the results of opening my data file. Okay, so now I've created my source file. Now the next thing that I want to do is, as I've put here, I want to use the CSV library. So again, I've already imported the CSV library, but I want to make use of one of the recipes in that CSV library in order to make my source data easier to handle. It's actually not just my source data, it's actually going to make my output data easier to work with as well. So what I'm going to do is I am going to create another variable. I'm going to call this CityBike Reader. And this is, again, I created a label, a label for a box in memory, and into it I'm going to put the results of running the CSV, a recipe, sorry, just hit escape to get rid of that message. It's an error and it's annoying. I want to put into that box labeled City Bike Reader the results of using a recipe from the CSV library. So the first thing I'm going to type here is CSV. And I'm going to ask it to create a reader that will, I'm going to ask it to create a reader that will deal with the contents of source file. And in this case, the name of that recipe, the name of the recipe that I'm using that comes from the CSV library is called dict reader. Okay, so it's short for dictionary reader. And a dictionary is kind of another word for list. It's not precisely a list, but that's essentially how it functions in this case. And so I'm going to say create a dictionary reader from source file. Okay. Now again, why am I doing this? Well, you know, it actually has, it's actually not dissimilar to what we saw, the difference between working in Excel versus working in OpenRefine. So if you remember in Excel, when we were doing our math, one of the things that we constantly had to take into account was the presence of the header row. And you remember in Excel, when we wanted to remember how many rows of data we had, we always had to subtract at least one because we had that header row. Whereas in OpenRefine, the header row was present, but it was not sort of muddled up with our actual data. So one of the things, you know, the sort of the numerical data that we were interested in looking at. So what one of the big things that this dictionary reader, dict reader recipe does for us is it does that kind of separation, and it separates the header row from the rest of the data so that we can still access that header row. We are going to need it, right? Because of course we're going to want to put it in our output file, and we're actually going to use it to access the data itself. For example, when we get to checking the start station ID, we're going to want to do that with reference to start station ID as the header for that column, but we want it out of the way. And so the dict reader does this for us automatically. So from here on out, we're going to work with the City Bike Reader data because it has transformed my original source data, right, that I opened straight from my CSV. It's transformed it in much the same way that OpenRefine transforms the data by kind of taking that header row, keeping it available, but kind of out of the way of the actual data. And I can test this because there is when it takes that header row out of the way, it gives it a different name, it gives it a label, and it labels it field names. And so I can actually check and see that this has worked correctly by running a print here and just making sure that I'm actually getting the header row that I expect to get, right? So I know that my header row is like trip duration, I think it's trip duration, start time, stop time, start station ID, et cetera, et cetera. So I can get my terminal here. Another trick for dealing with terminal is that I can have it repeat the last command that I typed in by just hitting the up arrow. So instead of having to retype Python 3 and then my file name every time, I can actually just hit up and hit it again. And when I hit return, again, because I have this print statement in here, the print statement will output it to the terminal, and I can see that indeed it does seem to be getting what I expect, which is that trip duration, start time, stop time, et cetera, all the way through to gender. So it looks like setting up my dictionary reader worked correctly, which is great. And now I can start thinking about constructing my output file and what that might look like. Of course, I am going to want that header row in my output file. So I'm going to go ahead and create an output file. And the interesting thing here is that when I create the output file, I actually use the open command again. When I run this script and I say open, I'm going to give it the name of the file that I want it to open, which I can just make up, okay? So it's very similar to using like a save as in Microsoft Word or something like that, where I say save as and I just give it a file name. I want to give it a .csv at the end because it's going to be a comma separated value file, but I'm going to say open and I'm going to say City Bike station 72.csv, right? That's going to be, again, my descriptive file name. But now the second ingredient, instead of being an R for read, because this doesn't exist yet, is going to be a W for write. In other words, I'm saying create a file, right? Save as, it's going to be empty to begin with. Which is, again, when you create a new file in something like Microsoft Word, it's originally untitled. You have to give it a title. Well, here we just have to provide the title right at the time that we create it, or just at the time that we create it. And we have to tell it, look, we want to write, we want this to be something we can actually output data to. And so we're going to have that W. So the reader, and now we want to create, so we created our reader, right? That's dict reader. We also want to create a writer for the output file. And again, this is because rather than writing everything manually, it's going to make it a little bit easier for us to write, for example, an entire row of data all at once to our output file, rather than having to go sort of like value, comma, value, comma, value, comma, etc. Okay, so I'm going to say city bike writer again, and I'm doing this, you see that I have kind of a convention going here. I'm doing reader and writer. I'm making those parallel, so I have source file and output file, city bike reader, city bike writer. This is just a convention that I like, but it is handy to start developing those for yourself because it'll make it easier when you come time to name your variables if you just sort of get in the habit of using similar, using those kinds of parallel constructions. Okay, so in this case, again, I'm going to the city CSV recipe book, but in this case, it's just writer. And again, what am I creating the writer with? I'm creating it with that new file that I made and put into the box labeled output file. So I've created the space for that file, and now I'm going to convert it to a writer. And I can test to see if this works by saying, by now trying to write a row to it. And the row that I want to write, of course, is, I think it's right row. Let's see, is going to be, and I know I erased that print statement, but it's going to be that field names. It's going to be the header row, right? I want to write the header row to my output file because that's obviously the first row in my output file as well. I don't want to lose that data just because I'm creating a subset of my file. I think I might. Let's just see how this goes. So again, I'm going to come back here and I'm going to hit this. Whoops. And did that work? Let's see. Looks like it did the same thing. So let's double check. Now, if this worked correctly, I should have an output file. And I'm just going to go ahead and open this. I'll just hit OK. And voila. I actually have a CSV that has my headers in it. So this is exactly what I was going for. This is a great start. I'm very pleased with this. And from here on out, I'm going to go on with the rest of my the rest of my script, which is going to be, now that I've gone through steps 1 through 3, created a reader and a writer, I'm now going to go through the source file one row at a time. And I could actually be even more detailed with this outline, right? Like I skipped the part where I write the headers. You all want to go back and add those things in as you go. So the outline is a good place to start, but you should always be updating it if your plans change, right? To have as much detail as possible. Because again, it's all just going to help you understand what's happening when you return to this. So likewise, I would want to be writing inline comments for every single line of code. So in this case, I would say create a reader to deal with my source file, etc., etc. So that's something that you all will look at as well. But for the time being, we're going to pause here, we're going to come back, and we're actually going to start going through our file and filtering for our start station ID.